Welcome and thanks for joining us for part two of our conversation about the Army. We're speaking with Paul Puckett. He's the director of the Enterprise Cloud Management Agency for the Army. And Paul, before the break, we mentioned the CAMO initiative. And that is a way of controlling costs, a way of controlling procurement. And you have kind of positioned procurement and the buying methodology for cloud services by Army components as kind of the control point to make sure that the costs, the architecture and technologies they're buying are all harmonized. So tell us more about CAMO and the acquisition-based approach to keeping this all in line.
So, if you follow a lot of the digital transformation work that's happening across the DoD, you'll start to hear some acquisition professionals talk about really the opportunity, the potential value is really created in your acquisition strategy. When we talk about the new BA8 color of money, if you will, that allows the seamless movement between RDT and OMA, as software is delivered, we understand that an acquisition strategy is really critical to creating space and growth, but then also creating structure for how you're actually seeing capabilities to delivered, where you're starting to put some governance in place. You've got the ability for oversight. You can start to see where these investments are being made, and then the actual value for the mission that's being delivered on the other end. And we could not agree more, especially in the domain of cloud. And so part of the strategy we put back in 2020 was calling out the fact that we needed a mechanism to buy cloud infrastructure. We needed a mechanism to secure capabilities in the cloud. And then we need a mechanism to actually build capabilities for the mission leveraging cloud infrastructure. Typically when we acquire a capability in the past and we wanted it to be enabled by the cloud, all three of those things would be combined. We would put out an acquisition that says, build this amazing thing for the Army mission, and I want it in the cloud. And obviously it's got to be accredited and secured. And so, how we bought the actual infrastructure or platform as a service offering or software as a service offering from a cloud service provider was kind of buried in the thou shalls of that acquisition. How we met the actual DoD policy or DISA policy when it comes to security and accrediting any capabilities leveraging a commercial cloud. Again, we're kind of a thou shalt that was buried, but the focus was on the actual need, the actual mission need, and the value that could be derived there. And what we saw in the typical model, we still see it across the DoD today, sadly, is these little stovepipes of excellence. They're leveraging the cloud, but the way that they're buying, the rates that they have, who actually owns the account with the cloud service provider? Where are the actual legal agreements in place for some of the SLAs or the SLOs that are being delivered? Who's actually getting some of the buying power? Is it on the corporate side of an integrator, or is it actually on behalf of the government? Those things matter when it comes to how you actually buy services. The same can be said for how you secure a capability. How you're actually monitoring the environment, how you're actually authenticating users into that ecosystem. Oftentimes, program by program, we start to see them deliver their own solution, their own technology that then comes with its own challenges of interoperability or even integration across the rest of the DoD. And then we talk about the actual scaling of how we build those capabilities. Typically, we find it's an all new acquisition for every single new initiative, and that's got long lead times to it. And so this buying, securing, and building model is something we called at the very beginning. We need to break these pieces apart. We need to create buying mechanisms that support scale. We need to create securing mechanisms that has thoughtful design around the environments and the architectures that you're implementing, the actual connectivity between all of your different zones that you want to run mission, so that we create greater space for how we can build capabilities, where we can just reuse the enterprise services. And now when we go and let an acquisition, it's more pointed to deliver value in some specific area that leverages cloud infrastructure, leverages a buying vehicle, and also leverages a secure ecosystem. So within the Army, the buying side is what we call CAMO. It's the Cloud Account Management Optimization. The closest pair to CAMO would be this future initiative of JWBCC. JWBCC, led by DISA, and really the DoD CIO, is all about creating a buying mechanism for cloud services in a multi-cloud model that provides a number of different optionality to different cloud service providers in the DoD. There's a similar model that we've put in place for CAMO. And the reason why it's called cloud account management optimization is because any time that you're building a capability in the cloud, you're going to estimate how much resource you're going to actually consume. But that estimate is based on an architecture. It's a design. I want my system to have this kind of storage. I'm going to have this much data, these different services. I want to be distributed in this way. That all enters a cost calculator for what you think you're going to spend. That's all something that is then, something you're planning for. You're budgeting for those things. You're programming for those things. And finally, once you get your money and you start building, oftentimes we find that we are not building the things that we designed because we're actually learning from the environment, which is a good thing. But that starts to create some discrepancies for what we estimated and now what we're consuming. And so there's this piece from the actual estimate side of the house to the actual spending side of the house, but how are you actually consuming the resources? And that's why we created Camo. And so now that's a mechanism for all of the Army to get access to a number of different cloud service providers that actually starts to monitor how they're consuming the environment, in addition to the context of what they estimated that they're going to do and how much money that they've spent. What we're finding is our money stretches further. The cloud is too expensive narrative is starting to die down. We're realizing that we'll be able to change architecture and change design, be more thoughtful how we're storing data, the different tiers of availability of data. All these things impact the cost. And then you're able to start to learn from yourself and project better, which right sizes our estimates, right sizes, how we program for these things. And then also right sizes how we start to consume. So that efficiency in line with the effectiveness is why we created Camo the way that we did, and why we think it's so important for us as good stewards of taxpayer money to ensure that we're getting the greatest return on investment when we talk about buying cloud infrastructure. This was called out in the NDAA when we talk about cloud as a utility. We need to change the way that we buy. We think that this learning is critical to changing the way that we buy, all the way from what we think that we're going to do, what we actually spend money on, and then essentially how thoughtful and effective we are at consuming the resources that we procured.
So in some ways, Camo kind of helps you get across the valley of death, so to speak, between the POM area or when you're envisioning something and when you're actually getting that spend and going ahead and expending money on it, that somehow the vision is preserved across that whole cycle and you get what is of utility to the people using the cloud services.
Yeah. And I called it out earlier about feedback loops, like that feedback loop of learning that allows us to then, field better capabilities. It's no different. It's that OODA loop when it comes to cost optimization of how we actually consume infrastructure, both in light of what we're planning for and what we actually see in the executed environment.
And originally, your office, now an agency, was set up in response to the realization that there was too many disparate, as you described, cloud efforts going on, and it was resulting in more of a cloud chaos than any kind of an overarching strategy. Have you largely got that cleaned up now and under control after these 2-3 years of operation?
Well, it's definitely cleaning up still. There's an architecture here, and I think that that's really important for people to understand is when we have these different silos of a cloud capability, there's an actual architecture that's being impacted, right? There are different environments that are being stood up and secured. Someone's on contract to do that, hopefully. There's a way that we're paying for those services. And so now when we start to talk about undoing some of that one-off scaffolding to fold into more of the global ecosystem that we're creating within Sea Army, we have to be thoughtful of the architecture. We have to understand the transport impacts. We have to understand some of the common services and how they're consumed, especially based off of the size of the programs, but then also the legal side of the house. There's a contract that's in place. There's some type of lifespan to that contract, and being able to start to transition the right pieces at the right time is really important. Especially, we don't want to interrupt operations, but we need to start to get our hands around that. So both from a contractual aspect, from an architecture aspect, especially from a mission aspect, how are we going to actually perhaps break operations? We don't want to do that. And then even a people aspect. And so all of those pieces have to come together. One of our first customers folding from that disparate environment into Sea Army were the ERPs. Wonderful partnership with the Office of Business Transformation there, as well as the Army Analytics Group, in demonstrating that value and being able to collapse into a secure ecosystem, have better monitoring and capability and oversight, but then allow the ERPs to focus on modernization, especially when we talk about enterprise business system convergence, or EBSC, that the Army is endeavoring upon. It allows them to focus on how they deliver better mission value and and capability. And so similar cloud environments that we're starting to fold within the ecosystem, TradeDoc starting to fold their capabilities in other initiatives across like AFC as well as AMC as we start to fold into that. But it's also then is impacting thoughtful architecture and design, bringing new regions online, new classifications online, new common services online. When we see some of that reusability across customers grow, that demand management is really critical. And so to complement that, we actually let a new acquisition for the follow-on work to maintain C-Army and then take it into the future for the common cloud shared services that we just recently awarded. So ECSS is really now taking those common services of C-Army and growing that out to scale, especially as we push into OCONUS, and especially as we also start to press C-Army as a capability into a private cloud construct, leveraging our on-premise data centers. All of this, in context of what the greater DoD is doing, especially with the hack over at DISA when it comes to optimizing our on-premise footprints to start to demonstrate more capability around private cloud. So it's really cool to kind of see this architecture thoughtfully, grow and collapse where it needs to, where we create commonality, reusability, greater security and monitoring that then allows the mission to be able to focus on how their digital transformation journey is going to go as they improve, soldier experience, soldier needs, and mission capability, leveraging the secure cloud infrastructure.
And the architectural approach and the use of the ECSS to control services and allocate services, does that then translate back to the fact that you at some point need to limit the sheer variety of cloud services providers, and then you have layers in place to abstract the differences among them technically so that everyone can conform to the architecture, which I would think lays between the user and the actual cloud providers themselves?
You're absolutely right. There are definitely layers there, though. We want the greatest opportunity when it comes to the hyperscale cloud service providers. When it comes to general purpose cloud, if you recall the DoD cloud strategy that was put out way back when, they talked about this notion between general purpose and fit for purpose. And really, it was this line drawn between basic compute and storage as a service versus some of the more platform enabling capabilities, let alone even the software as a service capabilities. And so those very fit for purpose software as a service offerings are now, services that should be available to all. Same thing when it comes to common compute. But what a lot of people start to lose is there's an architecture that's impacted. How are all these different things connecting? With the construct of the boundary cloud access points, starting to have these, physical stacks that are maintained by the DoD, starting to become pretty cumbersome when it comes to availability and connectivity. I would argue is more so just an architectural challenge. In the old construct, program by program acquisition, maybe two programs really need to share a whole bunch of data, but they were acquired differently and secured differently, but probably placed in the same cloud service provider's environment, heck, maybe even in the same region. But for those two systems to communicate and pass data securely, they were traversing a boundary cloud access point to proxy all of those calls. That's data leaving the cloud, egress costs, and then being brokered by physical stack, limited by capacity by the DoD, and coming right back in to a cloud service provider's environment. We're probably paying for a whole bunch of things and really blaming the BCAPs just because of bad architecture. So that design matters. And so when you start to see the demand start to kind of bubble up from what these capabilities need, you can start to be thoughtful as to how you start to place them, and then create space for acquisitions to go and have the best competition for the best designs and best integrators, bringing the best CSP solutions to try and meet out those needs. And then where appropriate, we can start to direct, hey, we want a hybrid capability here. We want to be agnostic of the cloud service provider here. We can start to say, like, hey, we want this opportunity, and then let the best in industry and the best in cloud service providers be brought to bear. And simply these just simply be, things like JWBCC and CAM, just enterprise mechanisms to go and have the best rates for the best access to the best, cloud service providers that meet DoD specifications. And so I think the buying, securing, and building model, breaking those pieces apart is really critical to allow each one of those layers to play at the speed that they need to play, but then really have the greatest reuse and capability across the DoD.
And we touched upon this a couple of times just now briefly, the JWCC, which is not there yet. It's not something you can buy off of yet, but are you needing to to conform to what that vision is for architecture and services, or is the DISA and the DoD CIO office that are engineering this making sure that what they do conforms to what the service is already doing? Because the armed services couldn't wait for JEDI, they couldn't wait for JWCC for many of the activities. So how does that all eventually interoperate, so to speak?
Well, listen, I don't want to speak for Sharon Woods or even Ryan, who's now running that program. But the whole entire point of JWBCC is to take some of the toil away from each one of the services and say, hey, we've got a DoD mechanism when it comes to buying cloud services from the major cloud service providers. And so the goal being there is the lowest rates and the fastest lead times for acquisition to be able to get capability. I know that it's JWBCC's goal to go in and deliver that. And so I think rightfully so is each one of the services saying, hey, wait, if JWBCC delivers better lead times and lower rates, that is the best decision for mission as well as for the budget to go and consume those services. But we got to make sure that we get the acquisition strategy right. We've got to make sure that the lead times, are appropriate. We can't have a centralized buying capability that takes 2 years for lead time to go get an account, right? How do you create all of that right structure in place, at the scale of the DoD, but ensure that you're being thoughtful of the speed that we need to be able to respond? I know that those are all priorities within the JWBCC team and the program. And so we've been collaborating with them, sharing them what we've learned and how we've executed camo, what we've seen, what works well, what hasn't worked well, things that we would change and improve. And really that learning and that feedback is no different than when the ECMO stood up. I learned from over at the Navy, what is now PO Digital, and how they created their cloud broker model. Learned from what the Air Force did over at Cloud One, where they had all the pieces together and the good and the bad that came from that. So we're all just really playing a game of leapfrog here. And so our hope is that JWBCC leapfrogs us, gets better lead times and lower rates that would allow us to then leverage their services and pivot the pieces of camo of the buying side over to JWBCC and just have us retain the learning side, the actual efficiency side. How are we consuming these services? And so we've been collaborating with this team. I hope they knock it out of the park, but that's definitely a work in progress. So we'll see how it goes.
And from what we've seen about the plans for JWCC and what about the camo and the vendors that are behind that, will there be some commonality between JWCC and service providers the Army is using?
Listen, I can't speak to that. That's all in the domain of JWCC. Part of our model is, as we see that demand grow for a common cloud service provider, we've got the ability to add it as a capability. And so I would imagine that JWCC is looking at similar demands when it comes to general purpose and fit for purpose needs. But I can't speak to compare of who's on, named on what list for who. So I'll let JWCC dive into that space. I trust them to make great decisions for the mission of the DoD.
All right. And in just a couple of minutes we have remaining, I just wanted to ask you, do you have, and maybe describe briefly, the ongoing post-facto mechanisms you have in place to make sure that as the acquisitions are made through camo, as the projects are developed, the missions are getting what they want and everything is in conformance to the architecture that you're trying to make sure stays in place?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you bring that up. I'd love to spend more time on this. So part of the model that we've put in place, sure, there's buying, securing, but it's that building side of the house. What are you delivering? What's the value? What data do you have? And so we've actually changed Army policy here. Is we've got a process called the Cloud Modernization Approval Process, where we're pulling in the organization system owner. We've got their G6. We've got the mission area owners. We've got the domain owners when it comes to the data. We've got buy-in across the CIO, the G6, as well as the chief data officer, and a number of different players when it comes to our being thoughtful about the data and services and capabilities. And then this is even folding in the acquisition side of the house over at ASALT, as well as contracting command. And so, as these capabilities come through the CMAP process, my cloud enablement division is working with customers when it comes to what is your architecture, where are you going, who is your customer, and we're starting to point them towards those enterprise services around data discovery, leveraging the data services catalog, some of the common services of software development and create our DevSecOps ecosystem. And it allows to build this community that starts to understand the different players and the different pieces and allows us to start to fit this architecture together in real time. And that influence both in like the design side of the house and then now into the execution side of the house is we're starting to see this architecture come together in real life. And it's really cool to watch because we're seeing data essentially deduplication. We're starting to see reusability of interfaces. We're starting to see common architectures, for instance, like in the tactical domain, different customers that would otherwise have their own ad hoc fielded systems are now collaborating in developing and delivering a distributed ecosystem around a mission command. So we're seeing that community start to come together. We're starting to see some organizations start to change their structure, some systems start to change their design. And I would argue that is where the greatest opportunity and growth is. This mechanism to get access to the cloud is really just the ante, right? It's just the buy-in, if you will, to play the game. The game is really start to how you unpack the value of data, how you start to redesign and architect these systems, and how you start to bring together perhaps disparate organizations that have been playing in the same domain and mission space, and now they actually have an ecosystem that facilitates the real-time design, essentially delivery, testing, and then operations of distributed systems leveraging the cloud. I think that is the most exciting piece. And I think that's really, back to the digital transformation strategy. It's that starting to see that realization of how we see this digital ecosystem come together. I think that's the greatest value that we see in the cloud is that growth in that community.
All right. Paul Puckett is the director of the Enterprise Cloud Management Agency for the Army. Thanks so much for joining us and for a very thorough discussion.
Thanks, Tom.
I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio for more of the DoD Cloud Exchange.